Welcome to Chronicles of Old Tales. In the vast library of human history, few stories are as well known, as cherished, as the words written by a young girl in hiding. Millions upon millions have read her words of hope, of youthful frustration, and of profound wisdom. But the place her story ended, the final, unwritten chapter, was a world beyond anything her diary could ever describe. This is a story you think you know, but whose full truth is often left unspoken. For 2 years, a small, hidden annex on a canal in Amsterdam was her entire universe. In its quiet, tense confines, she poured her dreams, her fears, and her sharp, brilliant observations onto the pages of a checkered notebook she lovingly called Kitty. That small book became a vessel for a life that refused to be silenced by walls. She wrote about the budding romance with the boy upstairs, the beauty of a chestnut tree glimpsed from a dusty attic window, her complex relationship with her mother, and her fierce ambition to become a great writer, a journalist whose voice would matter. And through it all, she held on to an unshakable belief, a core tenet of her being that has echoed through generations. In spite of everything, she wrote, I still believe that people were really good at heart. But then, with a final, poignant entry, the diary stops. Her voice, so full of life, so vibrant and resilient, just falls silent. And in that profound silence, a new chapter begins, a story of unimaginable suffering that her own words never had the chance to capture. This is not the story of the annex, of whispered conversations and shared meals in the shadow of war. This is the story of what happened after the last page was written. It is a descent into a hell she couldn't have conceived, a reality far more terrible than her worst fears. It is a 7-month journey through the darkest machinery of hate ever constructed. This is the story of Anne Frank's final 7 months, a story that must be told to understand the true cost of the one that ended in her diary. It was Tuesday, August 1st, 1944. This marked their 756th day in hiding, a staggering number that represented over 2 years of stolen life, of suspended animation. For over 2 years, the secret annex at Prinsengracht 263 had been a fragile, makeshift sanctuary for 8 people, a tiny island of existence in an ocean of war. The very air within its walls was thick with tension, a constant, humming wire of frayed nerves and unspoken anxieties. Outside, the Second World War raged on, its violent tremors felt even through the thick walls and the blacked-out windows. Allied bombs, meant for the occupiers, sometimes fell nearby, shaking the building to its foundations and rattling the already fragile nerves of its inhabitants. Food was perpetually scarce, a constant source of both conflict and worry, with every potato counted, every bean a treasure. The days were suffocatingly monotonous, a repeating loop of silence and caution, and the fear of discovery was a ninth, silent resident that never, ever slept. Yet, on that specific Tuesday, 15-year-old Anne Frank sat down to write. She was no longer the curious, somewhat naive 13-year-old girl who had first walked through the door behind the revolving bookcase. 2 years of forced introspection and intense observation had forged her into a young woman, grappling with the profound complexities of her own soul, her own identity. And her final entry isn't about the war, or the gnawing hunger, or even the omnipresent fear. It is about her. She wrote to her diary, to Kitty, about the feeling of being a bundle of contradictions, a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. With breathtaking clarity, she described the internal schism that defined her existence, the two Annes who battled for control of her heart. There was, in number 1, the face she presented to the world, a mask of exuberant cheerfulness, the flippancy, the joy in life. This was the Anne who was quick with a joke or a sharp retort, the precocious know-it-all who frustrated the other residents, the girl who could laugh things off to hide the turmoil within. This was her armor. But then there was in number 2, the purer, deeper, and finer Anne. This was the quiet, introspective girl who held her ideals close, who felt everything with a painful, almost unbearable intensity. This was the Anne who looked out at the night sky and dreamed of a future, who wrestled with questions of morality and love, who harbored a soul far too sensitive for the brutal world outside, and even for the critical world inside the annex. I'm awfully scared that everyone who knows me as I always am will discover that I have another side, she confessed to the silent, accepting pages of her diary. "I'm afraid they'll laugh at me, think I'm ridiculous and sentimental, not take me seriously." She felt this deeper, truer self was just too frail, too vulnerable for the world, and so she kept it hidden away, locked deep inside. "I end up turning my heart inside out," she wrote, in a sentence that perfectly captures her struggle, the bad part on the outside and the good part on the inside. It was a conscious, painful act of self-preservation. Her very last written words are a plea, a wish for a future she was already starting to doubt she would ever see, a future where she could finally integrate these two warring halves of herself. "I keep on trying to find a way of becoming what I would so like to be, and what I could be if there weren't any other people in the world." It is a haunting sentence, filled with the impossible, suffocating longing of a teenager who just wants the space to be understood, trapped not only by four physical walls, but by the watchful, often critical eyes of others and the crushing weight of her circumstances. She signs off as she always does, a simple, familiar closing. "Yours and M. Frank." She would never write in her diary again. The conversation was over. The pages would remain blank from that day forward. 3 days later, her entire world, and the fragile, complicated hope she clung to, was irrevocably and brutally shattered. The morning of August 4th, 1944, began like any other in the strange, suspended reality of the annex. It was a warm, sunny Friday in Amsterdam, a beautiful summer day that offered a cruel contrast to the lives being lived in secret. Inside, it was day 761 of their confinement. Upstairs, trying to impose some sliver of normalcy onto their abnormal world, Otto Frank was patiently helping Peter Van Pels with his schoolwork. It was these small routines, lessons, meals, quiet reading, that held back the overwhelming tide of anxiety. For over 2 years, this delicate routine had held. For over 2 years, they had lived on a knife's edge, praying each day, each creak of the floorboards, each siren in the distance wouldn't be their last. Then, sometime between 10:30 and 11 o'clock in the morning, the moment they had dreaded for 25 long months, the moment that had haunted their every waking thought and nightmare, finally came. A sudden, unfamiliar commotion from the offices downstairs. The sharp, authoritative sound of men's voices, followed by the terrifying, unmistakable thud of heavy footsteps ascending the stairs. Otto Frank recalled it later with chilling simplicity. "I was upstairs with the Van Pels family in Peter's room, helping him with his schoolwork. Suddenly someone came running up the stairs, and then the door opened, and there was a man right in front of us with a pistol in his hand. The man holding the pistol was SS Oberscharfer Karl Silberbauer, an Austrian Nazi officer attached to the security service. He was not alone. He was accompanied by several Dutch security police officers, men who were betraying their own countrymen. They knew exactly where they were going. There was no search, no confusion. They stormed past the main office, up the narrow wooden stairs, and went straight to the revolving bookcase that had so effectively hidden the entrance to the annex for so long. The secret was out. The sanctuary was breached. The 8 people in hiding, Otto, Edith, Margot, and then Frank, Hermann, Auguste, and Peter Van Pels, and Fritz Pfeffer, were herded from their rooms and forced downstairs at gunpoint. They were utterly in shock, paralyzed by the sudden, violent intrusion of the outside world into their sealed-off existence. It was the nightmare made real. Silberbauer, cold and professional, demanded their valuables. Otto handed over a briefcase containing the family's money and other precious items. In his greedy rush to empty it for cash and jewels, Silberbauer contemptuously tipped the briefcase upside down, scattering its contents all over the wooden floor. Among the things that tumbled out were stacks of papers and notebooks, the loose pages of Anne's diary. In that single, chaotic moment of terror and greed, the very words that would one day give a voice to millions of victims lay abandoned and unnoticed on the floor as their author was marched toward her fate. The raid took over 2 hours, a meticulous and cruel process. The 8 residents of the annex, along with 2 of their courageous helpers, Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman, who happened to be there that day, were formally arrested. They were loaded into a covered truck, the canvas flaps hiding them from the view of the Amsterdam citizens going about their day. As the engine roared to life and the truck pulled away, the annex was left behind. Suddenly, eerily silent. The clock on the Westertoren church, the comforting, reliable sound that Anne had mentioned so often in her diary as a friend in the lonely nights, kept chiming the quarter hours. But for the girl who had listened to its bells for 2 long years, time had just run out. Later that same day, Miep Gies, another of the helpers who had risked her life daily for them, and who had miraculously avoided arrest, crept back into the now violated hiding place. With a heart heavy with grief and fear, she and another helper, Bep Vosquigel, began to gather and scattered writings from the floor. Miep collected every page, every notebook, hoping against hope to save them for Anne's eventual return. She made a promise to herself. She would not read a single word. These were Anne's most private thoughts. She tucked them away safely in her desk drawer, a sacred trust to be kept until the war was over and came back to claim them. So, who made the fateful phone call? Who betrayed the 8 souls in the secret annex? It remains the most agonizing and painful question in this entire story, a mystery that continues to be debated and investigated to this day. For decades, suspicion fell heavily on a warehouse worker named Willem van Marin, who was known to be untrustworthy and inquisitive. Even Otto Frank himself suspected him for the rest of his life. But multiple official investigations over the years never found conclusive, undeniable proof. Other names have surfaced through the decades. Lena Hartog, the wife of another employee who supposedly knew people were in hiding. Tony Ehlers, a known Dutch Nazi sympathizer and small-time criminal who had connections to Otto Frank. Even, heartbreakingly, Nelly Vosquigel, the sister of their helper Bep, has been named as a potential suspect. A 2016 study by the Anne Frank House proposed a different, more mundane, and perhaps even more tragic possibility. There was no single act of betrayal at all. The police may have simply been investigating reports of illegal work or ration card fraud at the Prinsengracht 263 address and stumbled upon the hiding place purely by chance. Then, in early 2022, a high-profile cold case investigation, using modern investigative techniques, pointed the finger at a prominent Jewish notary named Arnold van den Berg, theorizing that he gave up the annex's address, along with others, to the Nazis in a desperate attempt to save his own family from deportation. However, this theory has been met with significant doubt and criticism from many respected historians, who point to a lack of solid, verifiable evidence and questionable logical leaps. The hard, cold truth is, we may never know for sure. Whether it was an act of personal malice, a desperate bargain for survival, or just the random, cruel chance of a bureaucratic world, the end result was the same. The shield of the secret annex was shattered, and its 8 residents were cast into the monstrous, indifferent machinery of the Holocaust. Their first stop after the arrest was the local Gestapo headquarters in Amsterdam. After a night of harsh interrogation in an overcrowded city prison, they were moved to their next destination, Camp Westerbork, a sprawling Nazi transit camp located in the desolate heathlands of the northeastern Netherlands. This was a place with a grim purpose. Over 100,000 Dutch and German Jews had already passed through its gates, a way station on the horrific journey to the death camps in Poland. Westerbork was a kind of purgatory, a strange and deceptive landscape of dread. It wasn't an extermination camp like Auschwitz. There were no gas chambers. Instead, it was a place of anxious waiting, of psychological torment, and of cruelly manufactured false hope. The camp had barracks, a hospital, an orphanage, and even a school. Prisoners worked, and life followed a structured, if grim, routine. But this illusion of normalcy was shattered every Tuesday, when a long freight train would steam into the camp. Its arrival signaled the weekly transport. Its departure meant deportation, a one-way ticket to the east, to a place people only spoke of in terrified whispers, Auschwitz. For the 8 from the annex, their situation was immediately worse than for most. They were designated as criminal cases, or Strafgeval, because they had violated German law by going into hiding instead of answering the call-up for labor service. This label landed them in the punishment barracks, where conditions were deliberately harsher and the rations smaller. Their forced labor was to dismantle old airplane batteries, a dirty, grueling, and potentially hazardous job. Yet, for one brief, strange month, they were together, and they were, in a limited sense, out in the open. Survivor testimony from this period recalls seeing, and there, still talkative and intensely curious about her new surroundings, though undoubtedly terrified by the constant threat of the Tuesday train. For the first time in over 2 years, she was under an open sky. But it was the sky of a prison, and any fleeting feeling of freedom was a complete and bitter illusion. They had arrived at the worst possible time. By the late summer of 1944, the Allies were rapidly advancing across France and Belgium after the D-Day landings. In response, the Nazis were desperately speeding up the liquidation of the remaining Jews in Western Europe, trying to complete their final solution before the war was lost. On September 3, 1944, just 1 month after their arrest, the final transport was scheduled to leave Westerbork for Auschwitz. That morning, 1,019 men, women, and children had their names read from a list. They were herded onto the railway tracks under the watchful eyes of SS guards. Among them were the 8 from the secret annex, the Franks, the Van Pels, and Fritz Pfeffer. The journey that followed was the true beginning of the horror, a kind of suffering that Anne's introspective life in the annex could never have prepared her for. They were brutally forced into wooden cattle cars, with 80 or more people crammed into a space that had no seats, no windows, and barely enough air to breathe. A single bucket in the corner, overflowing within hours, served as the only toilet. Once packed to capacity, the heavy doors were slammed shut and bolted from the outside, plunging them into a claustrophobic, terrifying darkness that was almost absolute. For 3 days and 3 nights, the train rumbled relentlessly eastward. The journey was a calculated exercise in pure human degradation. The air grew foul and unbreathable, thick with the stench of sweat, urine, and fear. The summer heat was suffocating, turning the car into a rolling oven. People got sick. The weak fainted from dehydration and lack of oxygen. There was no food and no water provided. Only the rhythmic, metallic clatter of the wheels on the track, a monotonous sound carrying them deeper and deeper into the unknown heart of darkness. This was a world away from the intellectual and emotional struggles of the annex, from the debates about history and the longing for personal freedom. This was a direct physical assault on human dignity, a systematic stripping away of every single thing that makes a person human. It was no longer about being quiet to avoid detection. It was about a desperate, primal fight for a single breath of air, for a few inches of floor space, for the will to simply stay standing amidst the crush of bodies. In that stinking, rolling darkness, and Frank crossed a terrible threshold. The girl who wrote with such poetry about the beauty of chestnut trees and the fundamental goodness of people was now just another piece of human cargo, trapped in a filthy wooden box, hurtling towards a place built for the sole purpose of extinguishing life. The hope that she had so carefully nurtured in the pages of her diary was being systematically starved, suffocated, and crushed, mile by agonizing, unforgiving mile. On the night of September 5th, after 3 torturous days and nights, the train finally shuddered to a screeching halt. The heavy bolts were thrown back with a deafening clang, and the doors slid open to reveal a scene of sheer, terrifying chaos. Blinding floodlights cut violently through the darkness, turning the night into a harsh, artificial day. Men in striped prison uniforms, the Sonderkommando, ran alongside the tracks, shouting incomprehensibly. SS guards barked orders in guttural German, their voices amplified by the frantic, savage barking of dogs straining at their leashes. This was the arrival platform, the ramp, at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest and most lethal of all the Nazi death camps. Immediately, the selection began. Men were violently torn from women and children in a maelstrom of screaming and crying. In the pandemonium, Anne, Margot, and their mother Edith were shoved one way, while Otto Frank, along with Hermann and Peter Van Pels and Fritz Pfeffer, was forced the other. It was the last time they would ever see him. Amid the screaming, the blows from rifle butts, and the overwhelming confusion, the girls caught one last, fleeting glimpse of their father, a bewildered, beloved figure being swept away in a sea of other men, disappearing into the hellish landscape. Of the 1,019 people who had been on their transport from Westerbork, 549 were deemed unfit for work and sent directly to the gas chambers that very night. This group included all children under the age of 15, and had turned 15 just 3 months earlier, in June. That small accident of birth, the fact that she had crossed an arbitrary age threshold, saved her from immediate death, but in doing so, condemned her to a slower, more agonizing one. Then began the systematic process of total dehumanization, designed to erase every trace of their former selves. Jannie Brandis-Brillislichber, a fellow prisoner who was with and in Margot until the end, described the horrific ordeal. First, we were taken to a large shed, where we were stripped in an icy room. We had to stand there completely naked for a while, until our clothes had been disinfected. 5 women under 1 trickle of water. No towels. Tattooed. Shaved. We were totally confused. Their heads were shaved. Their clothes and all personal belongings were taken away forever. They were given thin, striped prison rags to wear, offering little protection from the elements. Their identities, their names, their histories were methodically erased, replaced by the crushing, soul-destroying anonymity of the camp. And Frank, the girl who was so acutely aware of her own unique spirit and inner life, was now just another prisoner, another shaved head, another number in a crowd of thousands. She, Margot, and Edith were assigned to Block 29 in the women's camp at Birkenau. Life there became a relentless, brutal cycle of hunger, disease, and terror. The daily soup was a watery, foul-tasting liquid, often containing little more than weeds or peelings. The bread was hard, often moldy, and impossibly small. The primitive wooden bunks were infested with lice and fleas, and the women were packed in so tightly they could barely move or turn over. And over everything, day and night, hung the air itself, thick with the constant, sickeningly sweet smell of burning flesh from the crematoria, whose chimneys were a constant, horrifying fixture on the horizon, a perpetual reminder of the camp's true purpose. Death was everywhere, a constant, casual companion. You'd wake up, and the person who had been sleeping next to you might be gone, their body cold. Selections were frequent and terrifyingly random. A single glance from an SS doctor like the infamous Joseph Mengele, making his rounds through the barracks, could be an instant death sentence. Edith Frank, consumed with terror for her children, watched her daughters grow weaker by the day. She did everything in her power to keep them alive, often starving herself by saving her own meager rations of bread to pass to them through the fence of the sick barracks when they were later separated by illness. Witnesses from this time remembered, but she was changing. The vivacious, talkative girl was still there, sometimes telling stories to the other women in the barracks, a brief flicker of her old self. But she was quieter now, more withdrawn, her eyes reflecting the horrors she witnessed daily. She quickly learned the grim reality of the camp, that most people, especially older men, were gassed on arrival. She became convinced that her father, in his mid-50s and not especially strong, had been killed immediately upon their arrival. The hope that had been her shield for so long was cracking, crumbling under the immense, unceasing weight of despair. In late October 1944, with the Soviet army advancing from the east, the Nazis began to hastily evacuate Auschwitz, trying to destroy the evidence of their crimes. Rumors of transports to other camps, away from the gas chambers and the crematoria, offered a desperate spark of hope, and Margot were selected for one such transport. Their mother, Edith, was not. She was forced to stay behind. In an act of ultimate maternal sacrifice, she could have tried to hide among those leaving, but instead, she ensured her daughters went, perhaps believing it was their only chance. She would die of starvation, sickness, and exhaustion in Auschwitz in early January 1945, all alone, her last thoughts consumed by the daughters she had tried so desperately to save. For Margot, the journey out of Auschwitz was not an escape to freedom. It was merely a transfer from one circle of hell to another, one that, in its own way, would be even worse. Their final destination was a place called Bergen-Belsen. When Margot arrived at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in late October or early November of 1944, they stepped into a scene of utter and complete catastrophe. Unlike Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen had not originally been designed as an extermination camp with gas chambers. It became a death camp through a policy of deliberate, criminal neglect. As other camps in the East were evacuated ahead of the Allied advance, it became a dumping ground, a collection point for tens of thousands of prisoners. It was horrifically overcrowded, a fetid, sprawling morass of mud, filth, and profound human misery. By early 1945, The conditions had completely and apocalyptically collapsed. There was almost no food being distributed. The meager water supply was contaminated with disease. Sanitation was entirely non-existent, with human waste everywhere. The flimsy wooden barracks offered little to no protection from the brutal German winter, and many were overflowing, forcing prisoners to live outside in makeshift shelters. Typhus, a horrific disease spread by lice, swept through the camp like wildfire, joined by dysentery, tuberculosis, and starvation. In the single month of March 1945, over 18,000 people died. The camp was quite literally filled with thousands of unburied corpses, lying in grotesque piles on the frozen ground. This wasn't a place of organized, industrial killing. It was a place of disorganized mass dying. It was here, in this abyss of human suffering, that Anne Frank would live out her final, wretched weeks. And it is from this period that we have the most harrowing first-hand accounts of what became of her, primarily from two women who knew her from her life before the annex: her childhood friend, Hannah Goslar, and a resistance nurse named Jannie Brandis-Brillislichper. Hannah, whom Anne had known as Hannelie in Amsterdam, was in a separate, slightly better resourced part of the camp. One freezing night in early 1945, she heard a rumor that a Dutch friend was imprisoned in the section right next to hers, separated by a high, thick fence made of barbed wire and stuffed with straw, making it impossible to see through. Desperate for a connection to her past, Hannah went to the fence and called out into the darkness. A woman's voice answered. It was Auguste Van Pels. She confirmed that and was there and said she would bring her. A few minutes later, Hannah heard a faint, weak voice on the other side. It was Anne. Hannah couldn't see her through the straw and the oppressive gloom, but the sound of that voice was enough to break her heart. It wasn't the same and that I had known. Hannah recalled decades later, the pain still fresh. She was a broken girl, a broken little girl. She began to cry right away and was shivering uncontrollably, starving, and utterly consumed by a despair so total it was terrifying. "I don't have any parents anymore," she wailed through the fence, her voice trembling, believing with certainty that both her mother and her beloved father were dead. "We don't have anything at all to eat here, not a scrap," she cried. "And we are cold. We don't have any clothes." Hannah, who had recently received a small Red Cross package, promised to bring her something. A few nights later, she returned and threw a small bundle over the fence. But in the darkness and desperation, another hungry woman snatched it before and could get to it, and was left with nothing. Hannah had to calm her friend's desperate, heartbreaking sobs and promised to try again. On her second attempt, she managed to get a small package containing a pair of stockings and a precious piece of bread to Anne. It was the last time they ever spoke. The Anne at the fence was a ghost of her former self, a child who had been systematically stripped of her family, her health, her clothes, her name, and most tragically of all, her hope. That famous, defiant line from her diary, "I still believe that people are really good at heart," felt like a relic from another person, another lifetime. Hannah later said that if Anne had somehow survived the war, she did not believe her friend would have stood by that statement anymore. The reality of Belsen had murdered that belief. Jannie Brandis-Brillislichper and her own sister witnessed the sisters' final, tragic decline. They did what little they could, trying to find them scraps of food or a bit of water, acting as nurses in a world without medicine. But by then, both Anne and Margot had contracted typhus. They were skeletal, racked with high fever, delirium, and hallucinations. The girls Frank were already in such a weak state. It looked terrible, Jannie testified after the war. They had those hollowed-out faces, their skin was like bone over bone. Margot, who was older and had always been quieter and more frail than Anne, was the first to die. Already critically ill and barely conscious, she fell from her crowded wooden bunk onto the cold stone floor below. The shock and the fall were too much for her emaciated, disease-ravaged body. She died where she fell. Her sister's death completely destroyed what little was left of Anne's will to live. Jannie described seeing her in those final days, a haunting, desolate figure, beyond comfort, beyond tears. During the final days, I saw Anne standing there, wrapped in a blanket, because her clothes were full of lice, with no tears left to cry. Well, we hadn't had tears for some time. A few days after Margot's death, Anne died too. She was 15 years old. Jannie and her sister, with what little strength they had left, took their frail bodies and had them buried in one of the camp's sprawling mass graves. There was no funeral, no marker, no last words. Just an anonymous end in a sea of countless dead, a brilliant, vibrant light extinguished in the mud and filth and typhus of Bergen-Belsen. She died sometime in February or possibly early March of 1945. British troops would liberate the camp on April 15th, discovering a scene of unimaginable horror just a few weeks after she was gone. The war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, as the continent began to awaken from its long nightmare, and as skeletal survivors began the long, arduous journey home. A father searched desperately for news of his children. Otto Frank was the only one of the 8 from the secret annex to survive the Holocaust. Having been liberated from Auschwitz by the advancing Soviet army, he made his way slowly back to Amsterdam, arriving in June. He moved in with Miep and Jan Gies, the brave couple who had helped sustain his family in hiding. He held on to a fierce, desperate hope that his daughters, who were younger and healthier when he last saw them, might have somehow made it through. He already knew his wife, Edith, had perished in Auschwitz. For weeks, he waited, a period of agonizing suspense. He went to the train station, he scanned survivor lists, and he asked every survivor he met for any news of Margot and Anne. Finally, in July, he met Jannie and Lienja Brandis-Brillis-Lichber, the sisters who had witnessed his daughter's final days in Bergen-Belsen. It was from them that he received the devastating, final confirmation. His daughters were gone. His hope was extinguished. Only then, when all hope was finally and truly lost, did Miep Gies finally give him what she had been saving for so long. She went to her desk, opened a drawer, and took out the checkered diary and the loose paper she had rescued from the annex floor what felt like a lifetime ago. "Here," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "is the legacy of your daughter," and in the lonely months that followed, Otto Frank began the painful task of reading. And through her own words, his daughter came back to life. In the pages of her diary, he met a side of her he had never fully known, her incredible depth, her soaring ambition, her sharp-witted humor, and her brilliant, burgeoning talent. He learned of her most secret dream to become a writer, a journalist, and he learned of a specific wish she had expressed in her diary, a sentence that now read like a sacred prophecy. "I want to go on living even after my death." Otto Frank knew what he had to do. He dedicated the rest of his long life to fulfilling that profound wish. In 1947, after much effort, Het Achterhuis, The Secret Annex, was published in the Netherlands. It would soon be translated and published around the world as the diary of a young girl. Today, hundreds of millions have read her words. Her diary stands as a monumental and enduring testament to the power of hope and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. But the story of that spirit does not end on the last page of her notebook. The full truth of her life and her death must include the 7 months that followed. It must include the cattle car, the selection platform at Auschwitz, and the typhus-ridden barracks of Bergen-Belsen. The diary gives us Anne's life in all its beauty and complexity. Her final days give us the unvarnished, horrifying truth of her death and the deaths of 6 million other Jews and millions of other victims of Nazism. Here at Chronicles of Old Tales, we believe that to remember one without the other is to tell only half the story. And Frank's legacy is a dual one, a legacy of profound tension. It's the soaring hope of a girl who dreamed of a better world, and it's the devastating silence of a mass grave that stands as an eternal warning of what happens when that hope is systematically extinguished. To truly understand her story, we must be brave enough to look at both. To learn more about Anne Frank's life and to support the educational work that preserves her memory for future generations, please consider visiting the website of the Anne Frank House. Thank you for watching.